conflict, strife, altercation, fights, competition, disharmony, clash, dissent, confrontation, hostility, animosity, war. Did you know that in the English language, there are over 100 synonyms or different ways to say the word conflict? No, seriously, I can keep going. Dispute, contention, combat, struggle, opposition, disagreement, animosity. And what's that? You want old-timey ones? I can do that too. Fisticuffs, scuffles, fracas, feuds, tumults. For real, it doesn't stop. Rumble, skirmish, clash, dust up, brouhaha. The fact that we have so many words to describe conflict shows just how significant of a role it plays in our lives. And depending on what you are experiencing at any given time, there can be days when it feels like conflict is inescapable. So over the past few weeks in our series called Fighting Fair, we've been talking about conflict and how to resolve it in a healthy, respectful way. In our first week, we talked about God repairing our broken relationship with Him, which then allows us to repair our broken relationship with others. And last week, we learned Jesus' death and resurrection gives us peace with God, which hopefully should lead us to strive to have peace with others. We talked a lot about what it looks like to own and take responsibility for our share of the conflict that exists in our relationships. And if you were here for either one of those 2 weeks, my hope is that you have taken advantage of the opportunity to make steps toward reconciliation and peace in your relationships that might be strained or broken. But the question tonight is, what should we do when the conflict we experience is not our fault? Or more specifically, what should we do when it is someone else's fault? And what if that person that we are having a conflict with is also a follower of Jesus? So to answer these questions, I want us to look at a time where Jesus actually lays out a step-by-step plan for how to handle conflict between two people who are both believers. So let's take a look at Matthew chapter 18. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. If not, it'll be on the screen for you. But Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15 says, "If another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the offense. If the other person listens and confesses it, you have won that person back. But if you are unsuccessful, take one or two others with you and go back again, so that everything you say may be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. If the person still refuses to listen, take your case to the church. Then if he or she won't accept the church's decision, treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector." Those first 3 words are crucial to understanding these verses, because Jesus is specifically talking about how we should respond when we find ourselves in conflict with another believer. To be clear, there will be some principles that may apply to all of our relationships, but if we're going to let the Bible speak to us, we need to understand the audience that this was intended for. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some steps that Jesus lays out for us in Matthew chapter 18. Number 1, Jesus says to go to the person privately. This is a crucial first step. Remember last week we talked about how with some conflict, the other person might not ever even know that they have done something to offend you. Going to that person privately gives them an opportunity to realize they've offended you, apologize, and hopefully change their behavior. Sure, it may have been an awkward conversation, but if they are willing to hear you out, the end result is reconciliation and peace, just like we talked about the last 2 weeks. But if that doesn't work, Jesus says step number 2 is to take 1 or 2 others with you and try again. And the goal here is to recognize that simply continuing to argue with a person who has offended you isn't going to solve anything. If you decide to bring 1 or 2 other people with you, I suggest that you bring people who are able to somewhat be objective. Don't just bring people who are going to automatically be on your side. That's not going to help anything. Instead, you want to bring someone that you think the other person will also respect and hopefully listen to. An added benefit to bringing 1 or 2 other people is that they may also help to see things from the other person's perspective. They may see something that you didn't see and help both parties out. And hopefully this second conversation will cause the person to realize, hey, they've offended you, and apologize and change their behavior. But if that still doesn't work, Jesus says, take your case to the church. Now, this one can be a little confusing, especially for us today. But you see, back in the time of the New Testament, the local synagogue, the church, functioned like a lower court. So if something small happened, like your neighbor's kid kicked a soccer ball through your window and they wouldn't pay for it, you would take your case to the local synagogue where they would decide who was right and who was wrong. Today, most churches don't really function that way. Some still do, but most don't. So instead of standing up in the middle of church on Sunday morning and stating your case, I think it makes more sense to involve trusted leaders of the church. For example, you may take your pastor or your youth pastor or both of us to sit in on a conversation that you're having. And the goal isn't that we would be judge and jury, but having church leaders present is another way to help make sure that everyone is able to be heard and that the conversation would be civil. And hopefully this third conversation will cause the other person to realize that if they've offended you, they would apologize and change their behavior. But if that still doesn't work, Jesus gives us step 4. And step 4 is to move on, but keep your distance. Jesus says that if the other person still refuses to listen to you, that you should treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. That basically means that from that point forward, you might be better off if you decide to just keep your distance from that person. Just don't really have anything to do with them if you don't have to, at least for a while, right? At this point, though, you have a decision to make. Are you going to let it go and move on? Or are you going to harbor resentment in your heart? Honestly, that part is entirely up to you. But speaking from my own experience, nothing good comes from holding on to your anger when someone else has offended you. Moving on isn't easy, but that's also why Jesus made it a point to say that we should bring others with you in steps 2 and 3. Because if things still don't work out, those people can be an incredible source of encouragement when you're feeling angry and defeated. So now that we have the basic steps down, is there anything else that we can learn from this passage in Matthew? Well, I think, yes, there's a few other key ideas that we don't want to miss. And the first, I think, is this, that God's heart is still about reconciliation and not revenge. Yes, this process that Jesus lays out may ultimately lead to you deciding to stay away from the other person, but that isn't the goal at all. The motivation behind each step is to see that the relationship is restored and even stronger than it was originally. But notice how Jesus doesn't talk about punishment or revenge in these verses. He never says, make them pay for what they've done. He doesn't encourage us to take certain actions so that the other person feels the consequences of what they've done. Everything he says points towards a specific goal, and that goal is for the relationship to be restored. The second idea is that gossip doesn't have a place in this process. Jesus tells us to start by keeping our conflict private. He says, go to that person privately. When someone sins against you and you can't let it go on your own, it's best to go straight to them and have a conversation about it. Now, I want you to be absolutely clear that Jesus is talking about conflict, not abuse. If you are ever in a situation where someone makes you feel unsafe, please do not feel like you have to confront that person on your own. Like I said last week, there's a lot that you can do to help resolve conflict on your own, but when that conflict includes threats of harm, you should not have to handle it by yourself. If you aren't sure who to talk to, you can always know that I am here or that any adult here will help you, and we are here for you. No matter what, we will do whatever it is to make sure that you are safe. But assuming that we are talking about conflict and not abuse, talking about it with a bunch of other people before you talk to the person who offended you will most certainly make the situation worse. And whatever you do, do not put them on blast on social media. That will not help it at all. And even if the conflict goes to steps 2 and 3, the goal of bringing 2 or 3 other people into the conversation isn't just so you can have more people on your side and you can gang up on these people. The goal is for these people to help you resolve the conflict. Number 3, I think we can learn is everyone involved is still on the same team. Even if someone does something to offend you, it doesn't mean that they are automatically a bad person. It doesn't mean that they're a bad Christian. It might just mean that they see a situation differently than you. And in some cases, that's okay. Jesus never actually said that we all have to agree on everything. But check out what he says in John chapter 13. So now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. We don't always have to agree on everything. Batman is the greatest superhero ever. But we do need to love each other. And one of the best ways to remember that is that we are all on the same team. Everyone here is trying to figure out what it means to follow and trust Jesus. And of course, we're not all at the same point. Some of us have been Christians for a while. Some of us are newer Christians. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that we are all trying to accomplish the same thing. And even when we disagree, we are still better together than when we are apart. So besides following these steps that Jesus gave us, what should you do if you suddenly find yourself in conflict with someone else who believes in Jesus? What I'm saying is, how can we live this out in our lives today? What does this mean for us tonight? I have a few more steps for you, and then we will be done. The first is we need to be ready to forgive. And that's hard. When we confront someone who has offended us, our goal should be for our hearts to align with Jesus' heart. That means that we should see the conversation as an opportunity to seek reconciliation. But it's impossible to find reconciliation if we're not first willing to forgive the person who has offended us. And as you consider whether or not you want to forgive the other person, it's important to resist approaching the conversation with the desire to win or be right. Remember, the goal is reconciliation, not revenge. But this isn't always easy. So it's okay if you need to take a little bit of time before having the conversation. Especially when it comes to minor offenses, I would argue that if you are not ready to forgive the other person, you are most likely not ready to confront them either. Confronting them before you're ready to forgive them is like picking a fight. rather than seeking reconciliation. So be ready to forgive. And the second step is that you can choose your words carefully. Jesus' process for confronting another believer who has wronged you is extremely helpful. But that doesn't mean it's easy or it's simple. In fact, even if we follow his step-by-step plan, there are still plenty of ways that it can go sideways, that the other person can go haywire when we confront them. Even when done with the best of intentions, confronting someone who has wronged you or offended you can easily be interpreted as an attack on that person. That's why it is so important to choose your words carefully. And honestly, I would suggest planning ahead by maybe even writing down what you want to say and practicing it in front of a mirror. But as you plan your words, remember that God's heart is still about reconciliation. And the words that you use will either help you move closer to that person and fix your relationship, or to move farther away from that goal and farther away from that person. So during this time, I would also encourage you to spend some time praying and asking God whether or not the words that you have written down are the words that he would want you to say. An example of this would be in the book of Psalms. David gives us a great example of something to pray like this. He says in Psalm 19, "May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my Redeemer." But then once you feel like you know exactly what you want to say, the third step you can take is to be direct, but also be kind. This is probably the most difficult part of this type of conversation. Because on one hand, you want to be super clear about how the other person's words, actions, or both have offended you. But on the other hand, you also don't want to escalate the conflict unnecessarily. That's why you need to try and find a balance between being direct and being kind. And here's a few ways that you can still be kind even though you are confronting that other person who hurt you or offended you, and that is get straight to the point. All right, you've heard the phrase, don't beat around the bush. When you're having that conversation, get straight to the point. Start by telling them that you need to have a conversation that might be difficult for both of you. But also be sure to tell them that your goal for the conversation is to be able to put this difficulty behind you. This helps set the tone for the conversation and keeps the other person from having to guess why you want to talk to them. Get straight to the point, and while you're talking to them, please don't yell. Don't yell. Even if you're still angry about what the other person said or did, yelling tends to make everyone involved get defensive. And when we get defensive, we stop listening. And when we stop listening, we stop being rational. And we start fighting. When you're confronting someone, it is always a good idea for you to speak to them with the same tone and volume that you would hope that they would respond with. And then give them a chance to respond. Assuming that you've made it this far in the conversation, one last way to show them kindness is to give the other person an opportunity to ask questions and respond. Remember, there's that possibility of that they have no idea why you were upset. They might not even know that they offended you, so it's definitely okay if they need a little bit of time before they respond. Confrontation is not easy. It can be awkward, uncomfortable, and sometimes even scary. But it's also necessary if we want to build and maintain healthy relationships. And thankfully, the blueprint that Jesus gave us in Matthew 18 gives us a great place to start and a clear path for moving towards reconciliation with other believers.